Hi, everybody. I'd like to introduce Reed Maxwell and Laura Condon from Princeton and University of Arizona, respectively. They've been doing a lot of work in analyzing the the dynamics of hydrology across the world and kind of these interactions with the rest of geology and ecology and that kind of stuff, and just simulating it. Welcome, Reed and Laura.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's really awesome to talk to you guys today. So we're going to talk about the challenges of groundwater simulation and opportunities for terrestrial hydrologic modeling at the national scale. And just a little bit about me and my group. So I work on a range of water challenges. I try to understand three basic questions. How much fresh water do we have, which, as you'll find out, is mostly groundwater? How fast is it being depleted, which is actually mostly humans? And how fast it's being replenished, which is mostly ET. I have a large group at Princeton, and my team's a little bit unique. I have PhD students, of course, postdocs, staff, undergraduate interns, but our staff include 3 research software engineers and a full-time education outreach specialist and a community organizer. So really broad, impactful type work. So Laura's group combines physics, management, and simulation. And of course, Laura's a professor of hydrology and atmospheric sciences at the University of Arizona. And her group, she and her group study groundwater surface water interactions and dynamics, the role of human management, groundwater, particularly in the food, energy, water nexus, and then past and future national and even looking to global hydrology from the bedrock to the top of the treetops. So together, just sort of a big, kind of encapsulation of the sorts of things that we have collaborated to work on. Of course, science is a team sport. And our groups collaborate to simulate groundwater at high resolution nationally. We estimate water table depths and groundwater storage at resolutions useful for decision making. We'll have a little teaser on more of that work later. Simulating groundwater dynamics, and particularly groundwater surface water vegetation interactions in a changing climate. That's a big theme, and we'll highlight some past successes there. Capturing human impacts on groundwater, surface water, and connected watershed systems. Laura's group has had some really high profile papers and data sets on reservoirs and sort of how surface water reservoirs have interrupted dynamics of stream flow. My group has been focusing more on groundwater pumping, but together we sort of encapsulate some of the big water management aspects. And then last, we're building these software platforms to accelerate scientific discovery at the national scale and to democratize the results. So just going to jump right in. As many of you probably know, water is becoming a thing. And this is a data set that until 2024 was maintained for a long time by NOAA. And this is a bar chart from 1980 to 2024 of extreme events. And these are extreme weather and climate related events. And what you see is just since 1980, these extreme events have cost the US $2.9 trillion, which is a staggering figure. And we see also that these events are increasing and it's just getting worse as we move forward. Now, this is another product that you've probably seen frequently. This is just US, over the US. This is the 2024 $1 billion weather and climate disasters. And each of these icons is a weather, usually water-related climate disaster that caused in excess of $1 billion in damage. And we have things like severe storms, we have things like drought, we have things like fire, we have flooding. Of course, we have tropical cyclones. So a wide range of different weather and climate impacts. Now, if we sort of shift and think about what Laura and I focus a lot of our work on, groundwater is by far our largest resource. It is literally everywhere all the time. If we think about how much water is on Earth, only 1% of that is usable by humans, and 99% of that is under our feet. And groundwater is our largest freshwater reservoir. It's 99% of the world's unfrozen freshwater, as I just mentioned. But locally, it's about half the drinking water in the US, and it's about 60% of the world's agriculture. And as you'll see, it's also being depleted at an alarming rate, and it's really hard to see, really hard to model, and I'll mention data limited. Now, groundwater isn't just a bucket. It's not just a resource that we draw upon to, make it through dry periods. Groundwater flows. Lateral groundwater flow redistributes water across the landscape. And this is sort of a watershed pictorial where you have a lot of the processes that we talk about, evaporation from streams, say open water bodies, plant water usage, which we often talk about as transpiration, or the water that plants use as a byproduct of photosynthesis. We have base flow, we have lateral groundwater flow, we have infiltration, and we see that this is one big connected system. Now, this has been studied for some time. This is a very well-known paper by Winter et al., sort of showing exactly the same thing that we just saw in that last image. But if we take a cut across these streams, which is what I'm showing here, we see that we have these recharge and discharge locations. This is the so-called Toth problem in hydrology, which is another famous groundwater hydrology problem. But what is very interesting is that we have subsurface groundwater flow paths that can be very short, that move from the nearest hilltop to the discharge point. That might be a stream or riparian corridor. But then we also have these intermediate flow paths and these regional flow paths. And as you'll see in some of our work that I'm going to highlight a little bit later, these can be hundreds of kilometers in length. So these regional flow paths can be really quite long and very important in the continental water redistribution. And so this is not something that's necessarily a big surprise to the groundwater community, because groundwater is this important environmental gradient that helps shape landscape patterns. And there's been a lot of work conceptually on this. This is highlighting some of my work with a good friend and colleague, Stefan Collette, in a paper that we published in Water Resources Research some time ago, and another paper that we published in Nature Geosciences that same year, where we have this conceptual model of a deep or disconnected groundwater water table at the top of the hill slope, where this system may be water limited, or it may be the land surface processes such as transpiration are really only dependent on antecedent soil moisture or precipitation. There's no real subsidy. This water will disappear. Now, at the bottom of the hill slope,
your screen. You don't, for some reason, you're not showing anymore.
Okay. I'm not sure why. All right. All good again?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know why. Interesting. Okay. So at the bottom of the hill slope, the water table is always close enough to the land surface that we're never water limited. And in fact, in a similar conceptual model by Yang Fan, which is looking at root density and root depth, we see that trees might be waterlogged or have long kind of spread out roots. Now in the middle, what we call the groundwater controlled or groundwater critical zone, a number of us in the community have identified this really tight coupling between groundwater, soil moisture, and the land surface. And you could think of this in terms of root structure, you could think of this in terms of flow processes, but small fluctuations in water table depth provide really big differences in subsidies to land surface processes. And I'm not going to dive into this, but we've shown that this can have feedbacks to the atmosphere. This can have really important environmental gradients. So the last thing, and this is a really complicated series of slides, but the two takeaway are figures. The two takeaways that for some time, it has been widely recognized that watersheds and groundwater imparts so-called heavy-tailed or power law type behavior, which is what Roy Haggerty's work showing here, or even fractal type behavior, which is what Jim Kirchner's work is showing here. And long story short, you have to believe me on this. I'm happy to answer questions on the details of this. Jim published this in Nature 2.5 decades ago. But if we have a rainfall chloride spectra, it's white noise. It has no organization. And then if we look at what comes out of even a small watershed, there's a low pass filter or organization that wasn't present in the environmental signals that was imparted by groundwater in the watershed. And so this means that there's this range of paths and scales in groundwater. Water moves very slowly, physically. Darcy's law, it's a very slow process to percolate through soil and rock, but pressure can move quite fast. So the pressure propagation through the system is much, much faster than the actual physical flow. And this creates a system that really responds at a wide range of scales, where topography and our land surface processes have a really strong influence. Now, lastly, just to sort of convince you that this problem is hard enough, The subsurface is incredibly spatially heterogeneous. So we have this immense heterogeneity at all spatial scales, diving all the way down into small scales or all the way out to continental scale, and just sort of highlighting just the variability that you see within the continent. But this imparts a large uncertainty on our hydrogeologic parameters. So we study these interactions with what we call an integrated hydrologic model. And I'll talk about what integrated means in this context in another slide when I show sort of the equations that we solve. But we solve for 3D variably saturated groundwater flow. So we don't discriminate between unsaturated, phreatic or free water table or a confined water table. The equations that we solve automatically adapt and change depending on conditions. We have fully integrated surface water flow, which means that we solve the shallow water equations simultaneously in a global implicit manner so that we capture all interactions. Of course, surface water flow is much faster than subsurface flow, or can be. And this code was built from the parallel from the ground up. And then we have coupled land surface processes. So we have land energy balance, snow dynamics, and we drive this by meteorology. So all of the simulations I'm showing you are driven by hourly meteorological reconstructions. And so we have a daily cycle, we have land energy balance, we have a lot of these complicated land surface type parameters. And we do that through coupling through the community or common land model, which allows us for these interactions and connections. So for those of you that want to—
Questions.
Sure.
Your picture had plants, but your description did not describe the interactions of tree, roots, soil, those biological
All of those are in
connections.
there. Terrific question. They're all in there. Yes. So we have a 3D root zone. We have different root densities depending on the plant functional type. We have a wide range of plant functional types. We have all of these processes are basically included, and so we have transpiration that we simulate in a way that would be very similar to most climate models. It's actually a little more sophisticated than a lot of climate models, and all of that is interacting with 3D surface, subsurface, lateral flow. So, and the way we connect this in, so this is our mixed form of the shallow water, of Richard's equation. So we're solving for H in this, and this is a highly nonlinear equation because our amount in Richard's equation assumes a one-to-one relationship between our saturated water and our ability or our hydraulic conductivity or ability for water to flow through a porous media. And then we have these source sink terms that we connect into our land surface processes. And we include the shallow water equations, which I'm showing here, as an upper boundary condition. And so this is a nonlinear switch, so that switches on and off. So we don't actually prescribe that streams are flowing or that they have to flow. They are supported by hydrologic conditions, by the amount of water. So you can have full interactions, either infiltration or exfiltration, gaining or losing streams anywhere along the system. And we don't necessarily specify that there has to be water flowing in a stream. That has to be supported by the environmental conditions. So here we have this boundary source sink. This is our transpiration that comes out of the land surface model. This would be precipitation minus bare soil evaporation. And so these are all interacting in 3D with the system. And then we have a quasi-structured grid. So we have a terrain following grid transform. So that allows us to follow the topography very closely and also refine our grid near the ground surface. So this kind of novel approach, as I mentioned, this boundary switching within a nonlinear iteration ensures accurate coupling between surface and subsurface. And this is a paper that Stefan published in Advances in Water Resources in 2006. This is summarized in a geosciences modeling development paper in 2020. And our terrain following grid also accurately represents this complex topography. And I'm happy to jump into more questions about this. And, of course, happy to also provide more detail on the references. So we use multigrid and physics-based preconditioning. So the hyper PFMG solver, or which actually literally stands for Parflow Multigrid. Hyper is a large computational package that's maintained by Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Rob Falgo is still the technical lead for Hyper at Livermore, and that grew out of the Parflow project. Carol Woodward, who's the head of the Sundials, which is a suite for nonlinear ODE, PDE solvers, and she was the original developer for the Newton-Krylov solver, which is the nonlinear variably saturated flow solver. And then, as I mentioned, we have continuously improved solver performance and preconditioning, et cetera, over time. And a big part of this is that we take full advantage of parallel computing and modern architectures. And I'm showing weak scaling here. And weak scaling, just to remind everyone, is if you take a unit problem size that's running on one CPU or one element of a GPU, and you linearly increase the size of that problem as you also linearly increase the number of processors, either CPUs or GPUs. And if you have good solver, and this is showing that your math, how you actually solve the problem, makes a pretty big difference, and preconditioning makes a pretty big difference. And you have good software performance. And this is a fully coupled problem, so we're solving one matrix, one single problem. It's not a set of independent problems. So message passing is very important. You can see that scaling out to really large numbers, this is half of a million CPUs, or out to 250 GPUs. Actually, no, this is not 250 GPUs. This is 1,000 GPUs because it's 4 A100s per node. And so you see that we get really good parallel scaling out to these very large problems, which is an important part of what we want to solve. So just taking a breath. I'll take a quick drink of water.
Actually,
so
while
what do we
you do
do?
that, in fact,
Sure.
the amount of detail you're covering is pretty immense. And I'm not sure if it's a question for now or later, is how do you get the base data to parameterize something like this or provide boundary conditions?
That's the perfect lead in.
Okay.
This is all we're going to talk about now is data,
Wow, okay.
boundary conditions, problem setup. So perfect setup. Thanks, Greg, for the question. So in the early teens, Laura, Stefan, and I had this crazy idea that, if we have this really good parallel scaling, we should try to do this proof of concept of a continental scale integrated simulation. And so we built this proof of concept domain, the dreaded rectangular box, which we did for a lot of different reasons, but it encompasses upper Mississippi and the entire Colorado watersheds. And this is a 6.3 million square kilometer domain that covers much of the continental or contiguous US, coterminous US. Those are ambiguous terms that can mean the same thing. And we built this with 1 kilometer lateral resolution between 10 centimeter and 100 meter vertical resolution over the depth. It was a relatively small problem, right? 32 million unknowns. I was just showing problems out to trillions of unknowns. And as I mentioned, encompasses Mississippi and Colorado watersheds. And of course, this is fully integrated, right? So 3D Richards equation, shallow water equations, land surface processes, very nonlinear processes. And so we built this just as a proof of concept and had a lot of success with that. And so what we're doing now is our CONUS 2.0 or CONUS 2.1 model, which I'll dive into some of the data, some of the things that we never even thought that we would be able to do. We didn't even know if the code would converge, or if we get anything realistic at all. But our CONUS 2 domain now follows the US National Water Model grid. In fact, it's harmonized with the US National Water Model grid, both including the coterminous US and some transboundary basins. So this is our expanded CONUS 2. And we wanted improved subsurface representation, better topographic processing, and then eventually, we're moving towards groundwater pumping and other water management activities, as I mentioned. So this is a highlight from one of Laura's former postdocs, Jun Chang, and this was published in ESSD, which is a data journal in 2021. And I'm not going to dive into a lot of detail here, but just suffice to say that topographic processing and how you accurately represent topography has a really big impact on your simulation and on some basic hydrologic processes. And so this is errors in drainage area across a whole number. I think we've got 19,000 USGS gauges in our simulation now. And this is showing that as you improve the topographic representation, you not only get more contiguous streams, you not only get a more consistent DEM, and Laura along the way developed a global terrain processing. Most terrain processing is actually local and does not have global enforcement. Laura developed a global one, and you could see that we get much better results just from the statistics of how well it's representing things like upstream area. Now, in addition, we had to build a subsurface model, and Greg, this is really pointing to your question. And this also became a huge development too, a development exercise. And so this was led by Danielle Tiener Kreitzer, who's a former PhD student out of my group at Princeton, and in addition to a whole team.
Oh,
and
we lost your slides again.
Yeah, is it back now or is it gone?
No, it just lost.
Okay. Telling you, I'm running Chrome.
Yeah, that's it. I've not seen that particular one before.
Should be okay. All right, we're back.
All right, yeah, that looks beautiful.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about that. So in addition to topography, which I just showed, land cover, we built a full 3D geologic model. We actually built 100 different 3D geologic models, and then we tested them hydrologically. We tested them in fully coupled mode and chose them based on the best performance. And so you can see that we have, for these geology layers, we have 6 different geology layers. We actually have a leaky confining layer in between so that we can have confined, unconfined aquifers. We have different depths to bedrock. We have a whole wide range of heterogeneity and hydrostratigraphy built in. And so this is often considered sort of a hydrostratigraphic geofabric over the US. And these are not very common. And we never sort of intended to have to get into the business of building these ourselves. But this is where we're at. So at the end, then
this is in fact a whole ton of work that you're describing. How scalable is it to the rest of the world, or how difficult is it to create one of these?
Yeah, so we're exploring that right now. And Stefan has a proof of concept global 1 kilometer par flow simulation that's running all on GPUs that's in review right now. It's in the final stages of review that his group has led, that Laura and I are both collaborators on. And you know, it's some work. The good news is actually Laura and Stefan have, through an organization called GWEX, which is a global energy water exchange umbrella community that's mostly climate modelers, but they've been really bringing in hydrology more and more, and now groundwater. There are a number of groups that are building models comparable to this for other parts of the world. And so the idea, and I'll show this a little bit later, is that we can start to build out this community of modelers. We have really big successes both over continental Europe and China, and then continental West Africa, which I'll show later. So we have these 2 generations of the continental scale platform. So we have the original CONUS 1.0, which was published in 2015, and then we have the CONUS 2.0, which is the current generation, which was just published a couple years ago in Journal of Hydrology. And just to give you an idea of what it simulates, so this is water table depth. This is water year 2003. We have the data and capability to run any water years that we want. This is water table depth. This is a daily averaged product. So it's actually running hourly, but we're just making the movie daily. And you could see things like shallow, particularly in the Mississippi embayment. You see, you know, fast response to shallow water table depths. But then you also see in the West, you see a more seasonal response to snowmelt and more, you know, kind of seasonal slow processes. We can also look at other things like latent heat flux. And so latent heat flux, for those of you who don't know, is the energy component to evaporation and transpiration. And so as you go through the heat of vaporization, it's actually a lot of energy to do that. And so a lot of heat comes out of the land surface, comes out of the plants, comes out of the lower atmosphere to provide that energy to vaporize water. And so you could think of this as, it's a linear relationship with evaporation and transpiration. And so this is also something that we simulate. And you could see, at first sort of you see just clouds, you see radar, you see daily differences in radiation. But then if you look over the seasonal cycle, particularly in the spring and summer, you see a really big impact of the lateral flow and of all of this sort of topographic connection in the signal. So it's a very complicated, very subtle thing. And so that kind of launches into one of the
question. So what this you should be able to do is like give you a whole time series, and clearly you can do a season, but can you do like decades? Because this is a really good complement to climate models.
That's entirely what it is, and that's entirely what we do. Yes.
Okay, excellent.
So one of the things that we dove into in terms of science, and this is a paper that Laura and I published in 2016. This was published in the journal Science. We used our integrated groundwater model over the US, this is from CONUS 1, to understand how important lateral groundwater flow was for what we call transpiration partitioning. And so transpiration partitioning is the amount of transpiration over total evaporation and transpiration. And usually it's about 62% is sort of, so it's the majority component. And you may not be familiar, but evapotranspiration is terrestrial flux behind precipitation. And so what I mean by that, I mean that more water is moving between the land surface, the canopy, and the lower atmosphere than flows in rivers and streams. So it's a very important component, and transpiration is sort of this useful component. This is water that plants use to transpire. And so what we found was that lateral groundwater flow subsidizes transpiration. And got a lot of scatter plots here from our simulations, but I'll break it down in terms of the conceptual model. So this is similar to the conceptual models you saw earlier, where you have a hill slope and some water table depth, and where things are shallow, both transpiration and evaporation are both not water limited. And where things are very deep, both transpiration and evaporation are water limited. But what we found was because of the 3D root structure, because of trees' ability to tap into deeper groundwater sources, trees can hang on longer. They can hang on longer for deeper water tables. And they use this very creatively to survive drought, to survive a lot of different disruptions in their water supply. And this has been a very interesting kind of development in understanding how lateral flow connects in. And lastly, in thinking about land surface models, and land surface models are typically challenged to produce these, say in climate models, are typically challenged to produce these interactions. They typically have much lower transpiration partitioning than seen in isotopic estimates. And so we ran this model by turning off lateral flow. So this is the simulation I just showed you. And then we ran the exact same thing, but we turned off lateral flow. This is running just like a land surface model. And we get this big drop in transpiration partitioning because of that subsidy. And so this was a big part of understanding some of the deficiencies in climate models, in addition to processes for lateral flow. As I mentioned, we've also talked about groundwater pumping, and so our use of groundwater is a national issue. And so this is some work that was published in Science Advances in 2019, and this is work that Laura led. And what Laura was interested in doing was saying, well, if we have a simulation like this, can we do a pre-industrial simulation and a post-industrial simulation, or a pre-development simulation? So we can have no groundwater pumping, we can turn off all groundwater pumping and run sort of a before 1900 type simulation. And then we can use our best estimates for groundwater depletion between 1900 and 2008. And we can run the model again and look at how much, say, groundwater might be impacting stream flow. And so this is what this map shows. If we look at the chart here, so the darker streams are streams that have completely dried up because of groundwater pumping. Our kind of red streams are somewhere, streams that are depleted. Our blue streams are streams that are minorly impacted, and then our orange is sort of in the middle. And you can look at this by flow, you can look at this by major aquifer. And so, of course, in the high plains and the Ogallala aquifer, it's well documented that groundwater pumping and overexploitation has dried up streams. But then you also see areas in pretty surprising areas like the Upper Colorado, which is of course a basin very tightly allocated, where you also see stream depletion. And so groundwater pumping may be one of these sort of sneaky unaccounted for unintended consequences in terms of a lot of the water challenges in the West. So thinking about other big picture impacts that we can address with this model, another one is climate change. And it's pretty well known that climate change is exporting the West's water problems east. And this is a really nice animation that came out of Yale 360 that's based on a paper by Seeger et al., which was published in 2018. And this is the 100th meridian, which was classically over the US the divide between the more arid West and the more humid East. And it's been well documented that the 100th meridian has moved eastward. And that means that what was more humid farmland is now more arid farmland and would require irrigation and more Western water practices. So we were interested in this as well and ran a number of simulations that perturbed the temperature in a pseudo-climate type experiment. And this is also work that Laura led along with Adam Ashley, who's a colleague at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's senior staff there. And this was published in Nature Communications in 2020. And we ran a number of different simulations. And what we were able to do was look at, because of these different simulations with different amounts of warming, 1.5, 2, and 4 degree increases in temperature, we were able to construct an ET change per degree, or a sensitivity plot for ET. And these are colored by our basins, which are covered by aridity. So our more arid basins in the West are more humid basins in the East. And what we see here is that as we increase temperatures, the amount of ET change really is not sensitive at all in our more arid basins. And that's because these basins are already arid, they're already warm, they're already tapped out. They don't really have a lot of water to give. You increase the temperature, you increase the potential for more evaporation, but you actually don't necessarily know that you increase the actual evapotranspiration, because that depends on conditions. That depends on how much water there is in the system to provide that additional amount. But if we look at our more humid basins are very sensitive. They have a lot of water, and they're going to be much more sensitive to increases in temperature. And so they're going to be aridifying much faster. They're going to have a much stronger sensitivity. Now, we can also think about how much water this means. And what we see in terms of storage differences or our depletions is actually not dramatic in any one place, but they're widespread. And so if we look at our increases, 1.5, 2, and 4 degree increases in temperature, this widespread lowering of water tables can have these really dramatic impacts on total water loss. And just a sort of a, how much water are we talking about and putting it in context. So even our 1.5 degree C warming scenario, which I think, is widely accepted to be a target that we've already passed, this results in losses of 119,000 million cubic meters. So what does that mean? That's 4 Lake Powells, right? Second largest reservoir in the US, that's 4 times it, or 1/4 of Lake Erie, that's 1/4 of a Great Lake. And our 4 degree case is basically 324,000 million cubic meters, or 10 Lake Powells, or 68% of a Lake Erie. And if you want a kind of a cheat sheet, if you're a water in the West nerd, 30 cubic kilometers is about 24 million acre feet. Acre feet being units most used in water in the West. And then lastly, and I mentioned this is some work that's come out of Arconis 2 that was led by Chen Yang, former research staff on my group with Laura and I. And we also have done particle tracking. So we've tracked out particle flows similar to what you see in those TOF problems. And this allows us to determine these groundwater stream connections. And this just came out earlier this year in Nature Water. And what we find is that these connections between watersheds are really hard to ignore. And simulation of our watersheds really have to nest. We can't think of these watersheds as individuals, as distinct when we're talking about groundwater. And just a teaser, you can, the paper is open access, you can just go read it. Okay.
So questions.
To
what extent does this inform water policy? I mean, concretely, I'm thinking like the Calvin simulation does California water policy with all the crazy rules of pumping stations and so on, but it's unique in terms of like capturing that one region, or like Israel has such models. But big picture, it seems like you don't have that much understanding of what we've been doing, like irrigation kind of
Right.
stuff.
And
So what's our gap
that's
for
a,
that?
yeah,
Before we
what's our
follow?
gap? Well, I'm going to talk a lot about that next, because what we've shifted to is really thinking about how we shift and focus from just, can we do this, or how do we do these simulations, to how do we make these more accessible? And so I'll touch on this a little bit. I'll touch on some platforms that we're doing to democratize this. That's the democratized part. But it's a big challenge, and I'll touch on that more later. So
Okay.
I don't know how many people we have online or how many people we have streaming, but this is going to be interactive now, just to break things up. I've been talking for about 35 minutes. So we're
I'll
in the
play act as
midst.
necessary.
What's that?
I'll play act as necessary because yeah, most people are
Perfect.
on the stream.
Yeah, no worries. The stream should work too. It should be pretty real time. So we're in the midst of a revolution in computing and data. And just for fun, I'm going to have a poll EV poll. So you can either shoot this QR code if you've got a phone, or we can put this in the chat. Pollev.com, read Maxwell 700.
Interesting.
You can, and I'm not sure in terms of the stream, I guess you could just pull up a second device. You don't need to register. You don't need to authenticate. You can continue as a guest. It's just purely for fun. I'm not tracking any of this. It's just really to break things up a little bit and make it more interactive.
Yeah.
So the first two questions: what was your first computer, and when did you first use a computer? So the first question was, in what decade did you first use a computer? It looks like we are in good shape already, with a couple of responses, which is great. So 1990s and 2000s. I don't know how many people are on, so I can't tell what the
Yeah, this is not common to have live interactions. I'm not sure how many people are paying attention to.
oh, it's totally
responding.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we can do the next one now, which is, all right, what was your first computer? We've got Dell. Oh, it's white.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I can say for myself, it's IBM PS2.
I mean, okay. All right. So Laura and I also took this poll, and I started using computers in the 1980s. Laura started in the 90s. My first computer was a Sinclair ZX81 with 1K of RAM. Laura's first computer was an Apple IIe with 64K of RAM. And it's no surprise that computers have advanced substantially over the past half century. And there's a lot of graphs like this that start sort of, the new workhorse, or really the boom in the 60s, which was post-war, Cold War, with the CDC 6600 and 7600, which were the Cray computing machines. And then now, of course, we have our leadership computing through the national labs mostly, and other big compute centers. And then, of course, data centers with really large numbers of GPUs. Now, hydrology has also progressed from analog models. So early hydrologic models, early groundwater models were all analog resistor models. So you would have resistors that you would plug into a big resistor board, and they would be the flows between cells in your aquifers. And now, of course, we have, continental simulations over the entire continent. And this is some work out of Stefan's group that's not only all the subsurface hydrology to the top of the treetops, but this is actually also fully coupled into a weather model as well. So it's fully integrated weather, groundwater predictions. Now, our integrated models, as I mentioned, and this is just another snapshot from Laura's Nature Communications paper, these really represent these amazing non-stationary processes, right? So this is this baseline from the climate simulation out to our 4-degree warming case, but they're very expensive to run. And so in the time that we ran this in 2020, this was about 10 million CPU hours on a leadership, DOE leadership computing facility. And so, as been mentioned, it's impossible to say, let's make this, accessible to water managers. So in comes ML and AI. And this is another poll. We'll see, how many people are on, but it doesn't I think the effect is still there. So one of these is a physically based model. The other one is an imposter. One of them is an AI. And so these are both water table depth at time step 20. And your job is to say, is A the AI or is B the AI? And we have another poll. C. All right, we got one vote for B. Those of you watching later were like, why didn't I log in so I could play in real time? We've got some votes for A. All right, awesome. A+ participation. So the true answer is that A is ParFlow and B is an ML emulator of ParFlow. Now, it's really statistically, they're identical. There's no differences statistically between these two models. But of course, the ML one is thousands of times faster than the physics-based model. And so our group has sort of been working on not kind of traditional approaches or common approaches for ML integration. We've been doing really this ML emulator type approaches. And I have a few papers here. Two of them are published in Water in 2020 and 2021. And then even looking at soil moisture and some reinforcement learning and such. And our current approach, which was published last year in the Journal for Advances in Modeling Earth Systems, and this was led by Andrew Bennett. Andrew was a postdoc in Laura's group. Andrew's now faculty, also at the University of Arizona. And you can see kind of the whole team here. And this is now ParFlow and the ParFlow emulator, which is called FASTER, over the entire continental US. And so this is our CONUS 1 domain, and we're extending this to the CONUS 2 domain. And so, of course, this runs, not in hundreds of thousands of CPU hours on a large number of CPUs, but it runs in minutes on a GPU, which is an incredible increase in time. We've also done in efficiency. We've also done purely data-driven approaches, and this is work that Yiling Ma, who's a postdoc in my group, has led. She has a publication in Groundwater on this, and then we have a publication in review right now on this. And this is a high-resolution map of modern groundwater levels. So this is 1 arcsecond or 30-meter resolution. This is purely data-driven, developed with machine learning, and developed based on more than 1 million observation points. And the platform and the approach that we use is this platform and approach called HydroFrame. And HydroFrame encompasses a lot of different things. So I'll talk a little bit about the HydroData platform. I'll talk, which is where our hydrologic databases, as well as our simulation archives are. We have details on CONUS 1, CONUS 2. We have ParFlow resources, and then another package called Subset Tools. In addition, just the hydrogen platform as well. And so you're welcome to go check it out. It's all open source, free to use. You do have to register because National Science Foundation that supports this work requires that we track metrics. And then we also need to make sure that we don't overload the data center. So as I mentioned, HydroData has the largest extensive continuously updated database of hydrologic observations in the US. So we cross-cut different agencies. So we have streamflow, groundwater from the USGS, soil moisture, which is from USDA, snow, which is SNOTEL, which is also from USDA. We also have SMAP, which is a satellite product. We have precipitation and temperature from NOAA National Weather Service. All data are QA/QC'd. We have a public API that's open now, and it's fully Pythonic, so you can pip install a Python package that will give you access. You can register and then access these data directly from a Jupyter notebook. And all the data are processed and QA/QC'd individually, and we grab new data every week. HydroData platform, as I mentioned, has an API and Python packaging. So here's read the docs for HydroData. We have a number of example notebooks. We have short course material. We have a lot of really robust packaging around it that accelerates user development. Now, we also have a package called Subset Tools, and Subset Tools is a Python package that subsets inputs and outputs from our national park flow simulations, and it accelerates building watershed models. And so within a Jupyter notebook, with full documentation, full API, and plenty of examples, you can walk through and very quickly access and build different models that are not the entire continental US, but pieces or subsets of the US, and including forcing. We also have archived 1980 to 2024 forcing over the entire continental US at hourly resolution. And so our next steps, we think about the community, and this is part to your question, Greg. So our next steps are to transfer what we've learned to the rest of the world. And so the US has the most data and the most resources. And while we're not without our problems, the biggest water challenges lie within the global South. And we hope to use what we've learned to transfer these approaches to the rest of the world. And this really only comes successfully through collaboration and partnership. Now, as I mentioned, we're building this community of regional experts, and this mirrors other global communities in climate, ecology, meteorology. And I highlighted the work out of Stefan's group, which is the most recent is NAS et al., which is in geosciences modeling development in 2023, which is their EU Cordex par flow model, and then recently published in Hydrology and Earth System Sciences. Chen Yang and her group now at Sai Yat-sen University have published a continental China par flow model, and there's also continental West Africa and other models in development. And it's really critical to have local scientists and stakeholders who have ownership in the process and additional local knowledge. And we're building these research partnerships as much as we are, kind of all the other pieces. So just a last little highlight here. So where we're moving with this, and this is water year 2025, so this is running up to near real time, is we're building a national hydrology digital twin to simulate all the water from deep underground to the treetops over the US in near real time. And so this is water table depth running across the first part of water year 2025. And just to sort of highlight, the things that we're bringing together a blend of ML and computation to accelerate this digital twin. So we're using machine learning downscaling to go from our native 1 kilometer resolution to 100-meter resolution for surface water and 30-meter resolution for groundwater. And then we're also combining physics-based models with the ML emulators to accelerate these simulations. So this is just a quick teaser. This is all work that's very much in process. And if we roll back to that weather and climate disaster map, one of the tropical cyclones was Hurricane Helene. And Hurricane Helene was also caused incredible devastating flooding over Appalachia, and it was a very large, widespread area. Now, the severity of this flooding was driven by hydrologic processes, not just rainfall, and this region had not experienced flooding before. And so what we did was we actually, out of our digital twin simulations, you mentioned we can run for decades, and so this is what we've done. We pulled the hourly surface inundation depth, which is another product that comes out of the model. And we didn't run a flood Hurricane Helene simulation. It was just in our simulations, and we pulled and animated this. And you can see that we capture a lot of the widespread flooding that is much, much, much larger in scale. And this crosses many continental scale river basins, right? So we have the Southeast, we have the Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia, we have a number of different river basins that would be normally thought of as independent, but in large flooding events like this, they're clearly not. And this is driven by groundwater and surface water physics. So just to wrap up again, the sorts of things that we're doing: simulating groundwater at high resolutions nationally, estimating water table depths, groundwater storage at resolutions useful for decision-making, groundwater dynamics, particularly with vegetation interactions, working to capture human impacts on groundwater, surface water, and connected systems, and then building software platforms to accelerate scientific discovery and democratize the results. And I think it's really exciting moving forward, including groundwater and, say, global models, which is, again, what you mentioned. And because these ML approaches are so much faster than the integrated models they're trained on, we really see this way as a breaking the barrier for high resolution simulations up to global scales very efficiently using modern hardware. And of course, we cannot forget that we need to use this momentum to build a growing community going forward. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I think we have plenty of time for additional questions.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. Also, one question that seemed pretty clear is like, what was your approach for creating that digital twin? Because you have a rather complex dynamics to be capturing here between like subsurface and above ground, the very different time scales. So what were the challenges in making the emulator?
Yeah, there's a lot. So one of the challenges was using different architectures, and I can point you to Andrew's paper, but different architectures for space and time. And so the spatial temporal dynamics, it's 3D spatial dynamics, and water table depth, for example, varies much more spatially over short distances than it does temporally. But say surface water has a strong temporal dynamic. And so you really need to understand a different model network. And it's more of a UNet CNN type approach spatially, but then it's also more of a gated or LSTM type. They're all hybrid approaches, but an LSTM type approach in time. And it's really complicated model framework, but that was absolutely necessary to capture these spatial temporal dynamics over these short time scales.
And for you, that would be like hourly, it sounds like.
Hourly, the emulator is daily, but our digital twin is hourly.
Okay. And then so once you have a digital twin, it seems like you have a lot of interesting applications. I'm thinking farming, right? Because you can have climate forecasts, they give you precipitation, but I mean, it seems like you're already doing these analysis historically, saying the farm forecast for the next 20, 30 years, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is and Laura, just jump in whenever you want to answer a question as well. But this is exactly, I think, one of the important applications or spaces not to miss, which is there's a lot of activity in the weather forecasting timescale, particularly for hydrology, particularly for floods. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Google's efforts in this. There's a lot of, in sort of that 1 to 2 week time frame. But it's a real challenge to forecast seasonally or in kind of the annual time scale to look at more seasonal patterns or wet dry or even just scenario development. And so that's really a space that's really lacking in terms of the forecast capabilities out there right now. And it's a much more physics-based and a much more scenario-driven type approach. And it's still very applicable for a wide range of applications that need to understand how to reduce their risk and potentially mitigate their risk depending on conditions. And so I think that's a really important time space. It's very hard because it's very physics driven.
Right. So the thing that comes to mind is what should be fairly doable right now is if you had enough samples from a climate simulation, and there's databases of those, or you can have neural ones that just generate samples of future climates. Your emulator, you can just run the national water forecast for every one of those realizations, and then provide the groundwater levels for the country, but also fields and forests, that kind of stuff. I mean, in fact, have you started working on that kind of stuff? Because it seems like the thing you've just empowered.
That's exactly the vision.
Okay, and then in terms of go ahead, yeah.
There's a huge signal in that, which is that you can run ensembles out for the climate variability, but the decisions you make around groundwater pumping can send you in very, very different directions. So if you decide to curtail pumping or not curtail pumping, your outcomes look really different. So it's really kind of several other degrees of freedom that we have to think about. So it's not necessarily as easy to say like, okay, well, we ran all of the IPCC scenarios. Here's the range of what it could look like, because the human decision-making is just such a huge factor in the subsurface.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Jenry, you have a question?
Yeah, one short question. Can we create the map for a water footprint from this source data for different crops for whole years?
The question is,
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
Crop yields for whole US, is that the scenario?
Yeah, water footprint for crops, different crops for US? Because water is available different, like groundwater availability is different for different regions. The water footprint changes drastically. Is that make right indication for which crop will be right for specific region?
So that's a big part of it, and understanding water availability, and that's a big part of the message of the paper that's in review that I mentioned, that Yuling is leading. So there's pretty good understanding of the water footprint and location of different crops. The challenge is that a lot of times good growing conditions, particularly growing conditions, say in the winter, where Laura is in Arizona. Laura should really be answering this because she chaired a food and ag commission for Arizona. They don't always line up with your water availability. And so you might have good soil, good growing conditions, but not water. And so that's sort of an enduring challenge. And understanding how much water is available and how best to manage it. For example, where I mentioned curtailing pumping or managing pumping for water use is really important. I don't know, Laura, if you want to jump in on that more.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think what our modeling really adds, and our real focus, is trying to provide better information about the state of how our watersheds are working and how that might change and how water availability might change. Then you can overlay on top of that things like crop decisions, but again, with the caveat that a lot of that is really, really driven by our human systems and our human choices. So we can say something about the underlying system and how it will evolve and change. And then we can, of course, throw irrigated ag on top of that. But, the forecast about what the Central Valley of California and Yuma is going to do with ag is really a function of Colorado River negotiations and, a whole bunch of human factors. So we can't necessarily just say, okay, here's based on, here's what ag is going to do. Again, and that human signal is it's really huge, but we can still be really informative to understanding how we manage our ag systems by saying, okay, snowpack is getting lower in the Colorado River. That doesn't just mean that we have less, it's not a linear relationship. It can change as we have a warming climate, how much infiltrates, what the yield is in the river. And we can, with our models, say like, okay, this is what we think is going to happen to yield. This is what we think water is actually going to be available, and things like that you can't really see just by running an ag model and a bunch of scenarios around different decisions. And I'll also just note, as Reed mentioned earlier, that we think a lot more about seasonal to annual kind of timescales of decision making, where our physics-based simulations have a lot to offer because we can look at the subsurface, and that's something that can actually be used by ag decision makers.
So in terms of democratizing access to the predictions, because those Colorado negotiators, if they have this model, they can probably hopefully make better decisions. I would hope, but it seems like your emulator is a big part of it. Also, perhaps like incorporating your simulations into, let's say, chatbots, but basically interactive things where you can say, what would happen if, and response comes from the simulation, not from, the internet.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it seems like you're really focused on democratization. Any thoughts in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that's something we're also actively working on. And we have a project where we've got a subset model of the entire Upper Colorado River Basin. That's been a real focus for us. And one of our early partners, our staff in the Technical Services Center at the Bureau of Reclamation. And Bureau of Rec obviously manages dams in the West, not all the dams, but a lot of them, and they're the largest water and power provider in the West. And so they have really strong interests in good predictions and good management. And so just to sort of reiterate a lot of the things that Laura mentioned, I think are very important in this. And that's exactly what we're thinking of, ways to democratize, ways to make these things accessible. And the first step of that is to, produce the data, make sure that it's reliable simulations, and then think about ways that we would make them accessible to specialists, but then also, through APIs and things like that. But then the next layer down would be, how do we make them accessible very broadly? Chatbot, something that's quite straightforward.
Okay, well, yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Really appreciate it.